Whenever we talk about the Poseidon movies, people always talk about the 2006 movie and the original one. However, in the sea of these two movies getting talked about, there is one that often gets swept aside and beaten on. That is the 2005 Poseidon Adventure, which gets a lot of hate for being apparently a very terrible movie. It was originally a made-for-TV film made by Larry Levinson Productions, meant to be a remake of the original movie. The basic non-spoiler gist is that it's mostly like the original movie, except some characters remain, some are dropped, and some new ones are added. Except this time, it's because of a terrorist act that sinks the ship. And also, it's on a modern-day cruise ship rather than a classic ocean liner. Honestly, the ship in this movie does get a lot of hate for apparently being very ugly, but considering it's based off the Monarch, which was my favorite ship ever, I kinda like it. Besides, I would love to go on it if it actually existed. Hot take, when people talk about this movie online, it's mostly because they see the negative reviews, read those negative reviews at a first glance, then they talk about it in their video, and move on to whatever else they're talking about. But I actually quite like this movie, and as a ship enthusiast, it probably helps that this movie gives us the most amount of information on the ship that we get in any Poseidon movie. But for this video, I thought we'd do something different. Rather than jump on the bandwagon of hating this movie, we're actually going to do a deep dive into the movie and watch it to see is it actually good or not. Well, there are some bad things about the movie, I will say. A lot of it is actually pretty good, and I think you'll enjoy it if you do watch it. As you may have expected, this movie contains spoilers for the 2005 Poseidon Adventure, so if you want to go watch the movie first, do that. But majority of this video will be me talking about the movie, so if you don't want to get it spoiled, go watch it like I said. But this is your spoiler warning. Alright, let's get into it. The movie starts off very differently than the others do. In this, we see the leader of a terrorist cell pulling up to some sort of compound in Jordan. But little do they know that watching them is a group of people from the CIA and Jordanian royal armies that are monitoring them and plan to raid their cell. We then see the leader of the terrorist cell debrief the rest of his staff on what's going on, as one of the terrorists looks at a postcard. He has landed a job aboard the SS Poseidon as one of the terrorists. In the movie, it is later explained that this terrorist cell is trying to target US assets outside of the US mainland, on air, sea, and land. And this man is part of the plan for the sea. The operation is then put into motion, with the snipers taking out the guards on the building. Then, the SEAL team can move in to execute the rest of the plan. Then, a C4 device is placed on the door, which blows up and executes the plan. Then, the terrorist leaders inside begin destroying any evidence they have of whatever they're doing. They then move throughout the rest of the building, taking out all of the terrorist leaders. But when they go to the terrorist leader that they want to capture alive, he beats them to it and ends up shooting himself before they can capture him, meaning that they have no surviving evidence. The US and Jordanian army personnel find the evidence for land and air, but they can't find anything for sea, meaning that they have to figure out where the other target will be. Then we fast forward to Christmas Day in Cape Town, South Africa, back when Cape Town was still a functioning city. But instead of celebrating Christmas Day, everyone is boarding a cruise on Dulcet Cruises' biggest and baddest ship, the SS Poseidon. After this, we cut to security personnel who have finally done all of the checking, and so one of them flies to Sydney to meet them there, and the other one boards the ship. Then we cut to our characters. One of them an old woman based off Mrs. Rosen in the original movie, whose husband loved cruising, but ever since he passed away, she still can't stop doing cruises. Then we have a bishop going to work with the Aboriginals in Australia, a sea marshal who is based off the original character from Mike Rogo from the first movie, and a dysfunctional family full of everyone who hates each other, as well as a Australian filmmaker and his French wife. Also, another flaw with this movie, basically they keep on saying that this is Cape Town, South Africa, but you'll see in many scenes with Greek flags literally everywhere, and they basically go through as much effort as possible to make you think that this is in Greece, then say it's Cape Town. Then it's also the dysfunctional family going to their room and checking it out, and also arguing like dysfunctional families do. It's also probably worth noting that the boy, Dylan, is also a very big film buff and wants to make a movie while on the ship, and also record everything that he sees. It's a bit of a far cry from the original ship-obsessed boy from the original movie, but still, you know what they say, boys pick one personality and stick with it for the rest of their lives. We also then see that Mike Rogo, the ship's sea marshal, has been given access to a gun for the security of the ship. Then we see some terrorist guys from before pulling up to some slums in South Africa, because apparently that's where terrorist bombs come from. Honestly, in this movie, there's so much scenes relating to terrorism and getting the operation set up that with that intro, you would expect that this would not be a ship movie. We then see Mrs. Rosen run into the priest, who is lost. She then explained that her husband took 17 cruises before he died and got lost on every single one of them. We then get introduced to a scene that basically turns this movie into The Love Boat, where Shelby, who was the daughter of the dysfunctional family, runs into the ship's doctor. We then cut back to the terrorist group, who are being briefed on how to use the explosives. Basically, they have to set it to where they want it to explode, and wedge it behind something so that it will actually explode and not just rocket backwards. And well, because it's a terrorist group, what do they trade for the bombs?
Cocaína.
Then we all cut to the muster drill part, where the person who is running this muster drill, which is the hotel manager, who you'll learn is an absolute idiot later in the movie, is running people down on what to do. Then we see that Dylan, the boy from earlier, recognizes the Australian producer guy and tells his mom all of the famous movies that he directed. We then see that, wait a second, what is that? So apparently with the CG for this movie, they put SS on the front of the ship. Now when you place the name of a ship on the side of it, you usually don't include the SS, MS, or whatever part, but because the people in this movie were trying to capitalize on the original Poseidon adventure rather than actually research what ships do, they just put it here. This is one of the things that, although I like this movie, it definitely has its flaws, and this is one of them. Anyways. Then the captain gives his speech before Mike Rogo walks in. He is given a letter that's apparently come from the US Department of Homeland Security, where it says that there has been an increased attempt to commit terrorist acts on American-related infrastructure in the Southern Ocean, and the ship is carrying a lot of American passengers. But the captain tells him, find something specific to the Poseidon, then they'll talk. Then he sees some suspicious-looking things being carried aboard the ship, so goes down to ask the security officer about it, but apparently he says that everything is fine. Yeah, sure. Then the ship finally departs South Africa, destination Sydney, and everything is now fine and hunky-dory. And there's totally nothing on board that will cause the ship to eventually sink. Then the wife of the dysfunctional family, whose name is Rachel, apparently invites her friends on board the ship from her company without asking Richard, her husband. This kind of makes her mad because it was supposed to be a family vacation, but she's clearly only interested in hanging out with her friends. Then Dylan goes around filming everything, passing security features even better than the Sea Marshal can. This is then noticed by the dining hall supervisor, Mr. Aker, who hands him a letter basically saying that he can film anywhere on the Poseidon because back in high school he was a film buff as well. Then Dylan gets the idea to use Mr. Aker as the vampire for his movie, because apparently this ship has the best crew ever. And then we cut to the father of the dysfunctional family in a spa basically talking about what he does and explaining that the reason they could afford this cruise was because his wife owns a store brand that has sales international. But he writes books though, which doesn't bring in as much money as being the CEO of a giant store. He also vents about his marital problems to her. Also, remember this character because she'll be appearing throughout the rest of the movie. Then it's the first night on the cruise, and Mrs. Rosen goes into the dining room basically saying she'd just like to be put in a table where she can meet some new people. Also, this movie basically continues the theme of, for some reason, All the passengers and crew know everyone else on the ship's names and know who they're related to. For some strange reason, this always happens in Poseidon movies, and I never get it. Bishop Schmidt and also Rogo joined them on the table and they begin talking about religion and about Bishop Schmidt's role in the Vatican. Then Mrs. Rosen invites over Dr. Ballard, because for some reason either this lady just cruises on this ship a lot and knows all the crew, or everyone already knows each other like I've said. Although considering immediately after she introduces Mike Rogo and also Bishop Schmidt to Dr. Ballard, maybe that isn't true. But shortly after the conversation begins, Shelby gets sick and has to go back to her room, so Dr. Ballard follows her. There he finds her incredibly seasick and gives her a thing that'll apparently stop her seasickness. She explains that she was actually a student nurse and so she knows about that.
Do you feel like going to bed?
But we just met.
Meanwhile, in one of the ship's nightclubs, one of the crew notices that the Australian producer's wife was a singer on one of his shows, so comes up and introduces himself, then asks her to sing a song. She then goes up and sings a song for everyone in the nightclub, which they're all pretty amazed by because it's not every day you have a celebrity on your cruise. But of course I can't show you guys the song because, well, gotta love copyright. Meanwhile, that crew member goes and introduces himself to Rogo. They have a smoke together because, well, 2005 hit different. Then he asks Rogo if he's the sea marshal, to which he is originally shocked by because he wasn't supposed to know about that. He tells him that the ship's hotel manager told him, so Mike Rogo goes to confront this hotel manager. On the way, he passes by Richard, the dad from before, and down there, it is found out that Richard is going to see that massage lady a lot, setting into motion another drama that'll carry us through the movie. But little does Richard know that Dylan, his son, was recording him the entire time. How Dylan knew that he was going to be there at that exact moment? Well, it's a made-for-TV movie, stop questioning it. The next day, Rogo is giving a status report on the security of the Poseidon. He's basically saying that the hotel manager and 3 other people know his role now, but he was successfully able to confine the information and have him punished. It is now New Year's Eve, and the Poseidon is doing well. And also, by the way, this shot is also a bit strange, because if you stare at it for long enough, you realize that it just does not make sense when you know this ship well enough, especially when you've used the 3D model for Virtual Sailor that I've sailed around quite a while. Which is another issue I have with this movie, continuity errors, but we'll get into that later. Meanwhile, in the casino, Mr. Raker and Richard meet up. Because, well, Richard knows that his son is hanging around with Mr. Raker a lot and just wants to ask how he's doing, and if he's talked about him at all. Mr. Raker eventually says that Dylan is afraid that his dad is having an affair, and mentions that Dylan has shown the video to him. Meanwhile, down below, the terrorists are meeting to decide where the bombs will go to sink the ship. Apparently they will go at the aft of the ship, one on one side, one on the other side, to try to make the ship sink evenly. Of course, you know, if this movie, it does not go like that. But, while they're planning for it, a janitor walks in, meaning that their secret is now compromised. Meanwhile, Dylan and Mr. Aker are filming a scene for his movie in the sewage room because of all the cool-looking machinery. But, while doing that, Dylan notices something behind one of the tanks. They've found a body. They report it, and the Sea Marshal, First Officer, and Captain go to look at the body, but the face has been too heavily mutilated to find who it is, and his uniform was taken, so they'll have to do a checklist of everyone on the ship by holding another muster drill. His mom goes and looks after Dylan, and she's pretty terrified, reasonably, but with that, they're gonna have to call another muster drill so that they can get a head count on everyone on the ship. They call the muster drill and they tell the passengers it's because they're pushing into a big storm area, which, to be fair, they actually are, but the passengers aren't really looking forward to it. Meanwhile, Rachel goes to their cabin so that she can talk to Richard about what happened. During that talk, he brings up that they need to talk about something else, but Rachel already knows. She's seen the video. An argument ensues, and Richard decides for the rest of the cruise to go to the massage lady Shoshana's cabin. Seems like their marriage is going through rough waters. Okay, I'll never make that joke again. They eventually check off all the crew, and one is left, Eric Dodson, a man that's been with Dulcet for 20 years and on the Poseidon since day one. This scene also then tells us how old the Poseidon is, which for a 1985 ship, the Poseidon looks pretty up to date. Then, all of the terrorists receive instructions that Operation Trident will resume at 10 p.m. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Rogo seems to know who it is. Somehow, he has snooped out every single one of the terrorists. Once again, don't question it, it's a made-for-TV movie. Anyways, the first officer decides to go with him. Meanwhile, the New Year's party is in full swing, with the captain giving a speech, Shelby and Dr. Ballard eating, Mrs. Rosen and the bishop eating, and everyone just having a grand old time. But it is also now 10 p.m. The terrorists begin walking off their job to begin the operation, with one going up to take out the bridge crew and shut off the systems, one going to take care of the passengers, and the other going to set off the bombs. One of the terrorists goes to arm the bombs, but Rogo and the first officer are following him, because apparently it's part of a first officer's job to carry a gun. They find one of the terrorists, but he reaches for the bomb, so he gets shot, disabling one of the bombs. Eventually, the first officer is very concerned about shooting a random crew member, but Rogo assures him that it is indeed a bomb. But another terrorist is setting up the bomb. Rogo and the first officer don't have time to go to him. He hits the button. It counts down. An explosion rocks the Poseidon, sending things flying, and also some dancers in the ballroom crashing to the ground. Chaos erupts on the ship. Meanwhile, on the bridge, one of the terrorists executes the bridge crew and shuts off all vital systems to the ship, meaning that now no one knows where the Poseidon is. The captain can't get a response from the ship, so he leaves the hotel manager in charge and goes up to see what's happening. And then, as he walks away, one of the terrorists gets a gun and shoots the captain in the back. The ship is now completely in chaos, and, with water constantly flooding the ship, it is sinking. The ship leans over, then begins capsizing completely. People are flying everywhere, and water slowly begins to flood the upper areas of the ship. Side note as well, while we watch this capsize, because I can't show you the actual footage with the audio due to copyright, how could this have happened? Like, I get that there's a hole in one side of the ship, but that would not have caused it to go fully over. I guess it's because they didn't have the stabilizers out to make full speed, but that doesn't make sense. And apparently they also trimmed the ballast. I still feel like that would not be able to capsize the ship though. Finally, the ship is fully capsized and things begin to come to a rest, but it is still in chaos. People don't know what's going on. Some survive, but many are killed by the capsizing. The lights begin to flicker back on and people begin processing what is going on, but most are utterly confused and, well, literally in the dark. Also, quite ironically, the Dr. Ballard has a broken arm. Rogo eventually is able to wrestle the terrorist, who shoots through his hand, but he is still able to take the gun from him and wrestle him to the ground. Rogo explains to everyone that the man is part of a terrorist group that set off bombs in the Poseidon, and that they should not trust him. The cruise director then breaks his silence and tells everyone that Rogo is the sea marshal. Down in the cabins, Richard and Shoshana are also trying to find out what they should do next. They decide that they're going to try to find the ballroom because Richard knows that's where his family is. Rachel is looking for Shelby, but she looks up to the roof. Shelby and one of the dancers are stuck on one of the tables, because that's a tradition they have to have in the Poseidon movies. They also unfurl a blanket so that Shelby and the others can jump down. They say that she's gonna go right through it, but they have no other opportunity. After seeing that Dr. Ballard is hurt, she jumps down to go help him. Meanwhile, at the Dulcet Cruises command center, they realize that they have lost contact with the Poseidon, so they try to see if they can contact them via phone. But They can't. The Poseidon is completely lost. They then realize that Mr. Raker is still alive at the top, and that he and Mr. Kamal are the only ones left alive from the dining room. They ask if there's any passable hallways where they are, as the passengers have been debating for a while whether they should go up through the ship or not. The hotel manager says that they shouldn't and that it will kill them. Then, the big Christmas tree that they have falls down, crushing a few people, but Bishop Schmidt says that this is God directly intervening, giving them a way out. And, at the Dulcet HQ, they finally call out the US Indian Ocean Fleet, saying that they have a ship missing. Also, Dylan is talking to the Australian producer guy, and he says that if he records everything throughout the entire night, he will give him 20% of the profits, because he wants to make a movie about their escape, while actually being in this situation. That would be like if someone on the Costa Concordia decided to make a movie while the ship was sinking. Which, if I'm gonna be honest, would probably just be me. As Richard and Shoshana make their way through the ship, Richard slices his foot on some glass, which I would have expected considering they're walking on the roof right now. As Richard is bandaging up his foot, Shoshana finds the way out, having to invert everything, because, well, everything's a bit different when you're navigating it upside down. In the ballroom, many men lift up the tree and begin to make their way there. In doing so, they end up anchoring the top of it to the roof, all with Dylan filming. Dylan, being the smallest one, volunteers to test it, and he successfully gets to the top pretty quickly. Meanwhile, in the Diego Garcia Naval Base, 2 officers are at watch in the control room. One of them just because someone has to stay watch, and the other one because he just doesn't like the party atmosphere of New Year's, therefore he's staying inside. As they're doing so, they get a call from Dulcet Cruises telling them to search at our requested coordinates for the Poseidon, but they don't find it. They keep on rechecking, but they can't find the ship. They let Dulcet know that they'll keep trying, but the 2 officers know that they might be in for something big. Meanwhile, back in the overturned Poseidon, Rachel is trying to convince Shelby to come with them, but she really wants to help out the people who are stuck and have nothing to do in the ballroom before she can go up. Rachel brings a pen with her, and Shelby tells her that she can draw where they're going so that Shelby and Dr. Ballard can follow them later. Then Rogo forces the terrorist to climb the tree to the top, and he follows along with them. Dylan then films it, as he has climbed down to get more shots. The Australian guy and his wife, and yes, I'll be calling them that through the rest of the movie, then follow suit. Bishop Schmidt then goes to try to convince some other people to come with him, but the hotel manager is resistant, saying that he will sue them if they ever go up.
Fine. Go. You're all gonna die.
And we'll die trying. God bless you all.
Bishop Schmidt? I would like to come with you. My man, he was a fighter, so I'm doing it for him.
This way.
Meanwhile, at the command center, nothing is going well. The AWACS is inconclusive, the radar can't find anything, so they call over their colleagues at MI6 to help them because the agent they're calling over knows this region very well. And the movie ends with everyone making it up the stairs, and Rachel looking down at Shelby as she waves to her with a bloody hand. They know they might not see each other again. And the movie cuts out with a to be continued? Yeah, so I forgot to mention this, but the movies were actually 2 parts. That was part 1, and that was already long enough. We're about halfway through the video now, not even. So, strap in, and let's go into part 2. While going through the ship, Rachel finds a pen that she uses to write where they're going for Shelby. Then, a high-ranking US official and a colleague from MI6 arrive at the 5th Fleet Command Center. But the MI6 agent is able to call over a satellite, which should give them the photos that they finally need. The others keep making their way through the ship, but they keep on stepping through the roof, the soft parts at least. Dylan then records a little bit of the Australian guy talking about what they're going through and what they're trying to do. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Shelby and Dr. Ballard have stabilized everyone they can. Shelby says they should try to get up, but the cruise director is reluctant and says that they stay there. Meanwhile, in a little area, Mr. Kamal uses the pen that he got from Rachel to try to draw a diagram where they need to go through a shaft to get to the food area. But on the way, there's also an internet lounge, so they decide to stop at that internet lounge and send out an email like a virtual mayday. And at Diego Garcia, one of the Navy SEALs receives a call to begin his men to prepare because they're going to try to save some people on the Poseidon. On the Poseidon, they find a staircase and decide to use the railings in that staircase as a stair to get out. Dylan then films the Australian guy trying to climb, but while he does, he steps on one of the rungs that isn't exactly too stable and almost falls. But he eventually makes his way to the top. After a few more climb up, Mrs. Rosen is a bit worried, so she says she's gonna go wait with the others. But before she can do that, they stop her, and Rachel gives her an inspiring speech that reminds her of her husband, and that encourages her to fight on a little while. And they throw down a rope, and Mrs. Rosen ties herself to it, and they use it as a harness to pull her up, similar to what happened in the first movie. Meanwhile, back at the Diego Garcia Naval Base, the agent from MI6 connects the dots and says that the target that they were missing at the raid in Jordan was indeed the Poseidon. She talks with the Admiral and explains the situation to him, how it's almost certainly a terrorist attack, and that she knows what's been going on. With that, a plane from an aircraft carrier is sent out to go search for the Poseidon, as it is relatively close to where it was last located. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Shelby is tending to Dr. Ballard's injury when she notices the hotel manager pull out some pills. She goes over there to see what they are, and apparently it's a powerful painkiller, but he's taking them all for himself, for some reason. I don't get what's so addictive about painkillers, but anyways, he then throws it and takes the last one, so Dr. Ballard has to work with a broken arm. Then they reach the internet lounge, and there they find two of Rachel's friends dead on the floor. Meanwhile, Richard and Shoshana are going through an area that's already begun flooding when they find a woman on the floor, almost dead, bleeding out. She asks if their husband is okay, and they find him also dead. It is then that it is apparent to Richard and Shoshana the true extent of the disaster that they have found themselves in, and that there are probably very few people left alive on the ship. In the internet lounge, they hoist Rachel up and she's able to get one of the computers working. It's at this point she plugs a USB in and says that's her Christmas email and that it's 500 words. Wait, how did email work in 2005? I do not know about this. It sounds so foreign to me today, but whatever. Anyways, they email it. Meanwhile, in Oregon, Rachel's old friends receive the email. They eventually just write it off as some sort of strange joke email, especially because it's after Christmas. But after reading it, she sends proof that it is indeed her, and to contact the US Navy, so they do that. Later, the US Navy receives the email, and that removes any doubts for them that it is indeed a terrorist attack. Back on the Poseidon, they have found a room, but there's a red flashing light under the door. This most likely means that there is a fire in that room, so Bishop Schmidt says that he will go in and scout out a way so that they can go in next. Then, finally, some good news for them. The US Navy fighter jet has found the Poseidon, upside down and with a giant hole in her side, so the Navy can now send the SEALs to the location to try to get anyone out. Then, a little ways away, a South African fishing boat has received a message from the US Navy, and this message is to go find the Poseidon and help with the rescue in any way that they can. So, they accept. Meanwhile, Richard and Shoshana eventually find a big door. She says that this will lead them to the ballroom eventually. But when they open it, a giant wall of water bursts in. Richard eventually grabs onto a vent, and they're able to climb inside and out of the way of the water. At the Diego Garcia Naval Base, the SEALs are told on what they're going to do. Basically, they're going to try to use the hole created by the terrorist bomb to get in, then they're going to lead the people out through there. Time is running out for the Poseidon. But, thankfully for the people waiting, Bishop Schmidt comes back. They need masks though, so the Australian guy's wife tears up her dress and he gives her his jacket instead. They make their way through the fire, and, temporarily, Mrs. Rosen is disturbed because she sees a dead guy on the ground with a burnt face. But they eventually all make it through, except for Mr. Aker, who's having a really tough time navigating the area. But then, as soon as he thinks he's safe, he gets crushed by some sort of metal cabinet. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Dr. Ballard measures the water and tells the hotel manager that it's indeed sinking. But then, as they are talking, Richard and Shoshana make their way into the ballroom, finally. After a short reunion, the ship begins to shake violently. Then, with the other gang, Mr. Kamal is sucked down into some sort of pipe, drowning him. They break open a safety locker and find a ton of stuff in there after making it out of that mess. As well as that, they also are able to get some snacks out of the vending machine to keep them awake. They find the hatch that Mr. Kamal drew, and they all try to go through. As they're climbing through that vent, the Australian guy's wife has a bit of a moment when she's freaked out by an explosion and begins to get mad at him because apparently he only cares more about that camera and getting footage than about her. Eventually, though, she calms down and tells him to keep filming so that they can tell the world about what happened down here. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Shelby tells Richard that the others went up, and so Richard says that after getting some dry clothes for him, then they will go up. After making his way through the vent, Rogo is busy using the thing that he uses to make logs to talk to his wife one last time and to record something that maybe they'll find on his dead body if they don't make it out. Meanwhile, at the US Navy base, they're talking about the fact that there are not a lot of ships nearby, and that the closest ones will take 6 hours to get there, so the British intelligence agent is frustrated that there's nothing really that they can do, but the trawler is well on its way. Meanwhile, on the Poseidon, we are seeing another reference to the original movie, with this large shaft that I assume is the funnel shaft, but whatever, it's a cheap movie, of course they'd throw in a cheap reference. But yeah, so it's supposed to reference the funnel shaft that they found in the first movie, except it doesn't have an end to it. The Australian guy begins climbing, but his wife is not so keen. He tells her to not look down, but they're both pretty scared, so it's going to take a long time for them to get up. The cruise director is helping Mrs. Rosen up the ladder, but she's able to somehow pull up all her weight and use a ladder at probably 82 years old. I don't know how old she is, but still. But then they begin to hear more rumbling, and a noise makes their way towards him. The cruise director Martin looks down a vent near him, and he sees a ton of water making his way towards him. This pushes him off and down the shaft, falling in a very bad CG part to his death. They begin to make their way up, but Mrs. Rosen and a lot of others are pretty sad, because it was Mr. Aker who was taking care of her, then it was the cruise director, now who is it gonna be? But some hope arrives. A ship appears, and the Navy SEALs begin dropping down to go help them. Eventually, they grab their gear and make their way onto the trawler. The lead goes up to the bridge to introduce himself to the captain. As they're talking, the Navy SEAL guy says that they need to dump the catch on their ship, throw all of the fish on their fishing boat overboard, because the lighter you are, the faster you go, apparently in the ship world, and they need all they can to reach the Poseidon on time. Meanwhile, in the Poseidon, Bishop Schmidt, Rachel, and Dylan decide to scout ahead so that they can find a path there. But, as they're doing that, the bishop gets lost, and Rachel is mad at him for leading them in the wrong direction, so they have a short argument. But, every second they wait, the water in the Poseidon gets higher. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Richard, Shoshana, Shelby, and Dr. Ballard are contemplating how to get up, and Dr. Ballard says that he can make it up just fine up the tree, but then the hotel manager comes over and tells them to stop, but they all ignore him. As Shelby is climbing up the tree, the hotel manager tries to grab her off, but Dr. Ballard and Richard are able to beat him up, pretty much, and throw him off, which a lot of people are kind of amused by because he's being a bit of a control freak. After saving a lot of their lives and helping them with their pain, Shelby tries to convince people to come with her. One guy comes up and basically says that they can't go up with them because his wife is too hurt, but to gives her some stuff to give to their kids. They begin to make their way up the tree, with everyone but Dr. Ballard making it up. They hear a crashing sound, but then, as they do, the lights go out, and water floods the ballroom, finally proving the guys who escaped right. They try to coordinate everyone as they crowd around the tree and begin climbing. They grab Dr. Ballard off, but then he accidentally lets go of the tree, and it crashes back down onto the ballroom floor. They try to recorrect it, but it's too late. No one else is going to be able to make it out of the ballroom. Meanwhile, the others are still waiting for Dylan, the bishop, and Rachel to come back. But Rogo is getting a bit impatient. Some contemplate continuing going, but others want to stay and wait. So, eventually, they leave to go find another way. Finally, after a little while, they all begin to make their way back, and they say that they indeed did find a way. They say that they found a way, but unfortunately, they'll have to do some swimming, because the way they found is a deck down. Or up, technically. Just like in the first movie, they say that they need someone to swim to the other side with a rope, and to then tie it to the other side so that they can pull it. Mrs. Rosen is saying that she can do it, but the other two guys don't believe her and say that she should stay out of this. And, without warning, she jumps in and begins swimming. Basically, her defense is that she swam a lot in high school, so she's fine for it, totally. Bishop Schmidt then jumps in because he's a bit skeptical of her abilities. But then, as they're going, Mrs. Rosen begins to lose air, so she goes to the top, which I don't really get this whole drama about the swimming thing, because apparently there's a thin layer of air on top of the part that they're swimming, so why don't they just swim there so that they can always have air? I don't get it. They keep going, and eventually, they finally make it to the other end. Mrs. Rosen gives the rope to Bishop Schmidt so that he can tug on it and let the others know that it's ready. Eventually, though, Mrs. Rosen begins to get very, very weak, and falls to the floor. Then comes a very long and drawn-out scene, where, basically, Bishop Schmidt is telling her that she did great, and that she can keep on going on, but she knows that she only has so long left. Why? I don't know. I guess she's just coincidentally dying of old age right as they're finishing the swim segment, because that's how bad made-for-TV movies go. This movie isn't bad, though. She also gives her necklace to Bishop Schmidt so that they can bring it to her family. Then, Bishop Schmidt begins telling her a peaceful story about a park opposite of their apartment. Children playing, an ice cream man selling ice cream, and, basically, she says her last words, that she misses her husband and can't wait to be back with him. And then, of course, she coincidentally dies of old age right then and there. If someone could tell me what this could be, I don't know, maybe a heart attack, but the last movie it was definitely a heart attack. This, I don't know. One by one, the others make it up, and they realize what's happened to Miss Rosen. But, some good news for the gang. Basically, Trawler has found the Poseidon, and they begin getting their gear ready to board through the open door. As the others are going through, Richard tells Shelby a long and emotional speech about how proud he is of her and blah 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 blah. We don't have time for emotional nice things on this channel, so let's keep going. Eventually, they find Rogo, and he tells them that the others went the other way. Then, after all this time, finally, the others make it to an area that's completely blocked off and only a small smidge of light goes through. There's supposed to be a giant hole there, but debris has clogged it up. And then, the two groups finally reunite, with the family being able to reunite, whether for better or for worse. The Navy SEALs finally make it to the Poseidon, and they use grappling hooks to get their way in. The Navy SEALs then begin banging on the wall of debris to see if anyone's there. Also, why did they bring guns on this rescue operation? I get that they're Navy SEALs, but seriously? Anyways, the people hear them, and they yell out for help. They begin talking with Rogo because he was a part in Operation Desert Storm. Basically, then, they say that they need to set up some C4 explosives to try to unlodge it. They say that it could ignite trapped gases, but it's worth the risk. They reach a long bar through with the other explosive devices and a walkie-talkie so that they can talk with each other. And also, Shelby uses that to put some stuff in so that it can go where it needs to go, and also Rachel. They finally set off the explosive charges, but that doesn't do anything. Nothing happens. They say that they need to go to the other side and set off the explosive device, but as they do, another large rattling rocks the ship. They don't exactly know what it is, but they say that it's because the Poseidon is slowly sinking. They make their way to the engine room, which will allow them to get to the other side for some reason, but it's a tangled mess of rubble, and also a fiery pit below, where oil and fuel from the machinery has caught the water on fire, which, yes, is a real thing that can happen. They are able to cut down a catwalk, which falls back into place over what I can only describe as a terrible CG fire. Okay, as much as people hate on this movie, this scene is probably all that they've seen. And it's true, this scene is very poorly executed. I won't defend it. Bishop Schmidt is the first to walk across the bridge, and is able to make it successfully to the other side, but has to walk carefully because the stability of the catwalk is in question. Richard is next to go, but before going, he says some final words, if he does fall, to Dylan, Shelby, and even Rachel. After some more bad CG fire, he too is able to make his way across the catwalk, barely. The SEALs radio to Rogo that they don't have much time, and that they need to evacuate the Poseidon now, so they step up the pace. The Navy Command hears about the 11 survivors, but they're disappointed, and they say that there has to be more. The Australian guy and his wife are able to make it across, but now it's Rogo and the terrorists' time. But he won't go, because Rogo has nothing to give him. He knows he's probably going to be executed anyways, so what's the point? His mission has been accomplished. Then, Rogo volunteers to fly him out to see his family after he's been interrogated. They begin to make their way slowly across the bridge. But then, a shaking noise rocks the ship. Both of them fall to the ground, and the terrorist takes that as his opportunity, wrestling Rogo. The gun falls into the fiery-filled water, and both of them begin hanging off the catwalk. Then, the terrorist says, "You will die with me." Rogo replies, "Not today." Then, he kicks him, and the terrorist falls into the water, in a scene that I can only describe as terrible CG. Okay, I just have to mention this scene. This is gonna go on a loop here for a while. This is a very strange scene, and when I first watched it, I was actually surprised at the quality of the CG, because the outside shots of the ship don't look that bad early on in the movie, but now they look absolutely horrible. What was that CG? I don't know, but this is always mentioned whenever discussing this movie, which I love. Anyways, Rogo is able to make it back up onto the catwalk and walks across. Next, Dylan and Rachel walk across, but as they do, a large bad CG explosion spooks Dylan and stops him. He's scared and tells Rachel that he's failed the high school balance beam test. She assures him that it's not like this, and I don't know why they're overreacting because this catwalk is actually quite wide. Anyways, they eventually are able to make it across. Then, Shelby and Dr. Ballard begin to walk across, but as they do, another large explosion rocks the ship. Dr. Ballard falls to his feet, and Rogo asks the SEALs outside what was that. They tell him that apparently the Poseidon is now fully sinking, and that they need to get out. Finally is Shoshana. She begins to walk across, and Richard sticks out his hand waiting for her as she walks across. But then, another loud explosion rocks the ship. The catwalk falls in one of the more impressive stunt scenes of the movie, and Richard is able to make it up, but Shoshana is left dangling from there. It's no use trying to save her, and in another bad CG fire scene, she falls to her death. Richard is sad at Shoshana's death, but looks at Rachel, now knowing that he still has someone to fight for and someone to love. Finally, the team are able to make it to the other side of the ship, to where the bomb is. Finally, they find the bomb, and, with help from the SEALs, they're able to try to figure out a way to reconfigure it. But, unfortunately, someone is going to have to sacrifice themselves to blow it up. The Poseidon only has minutes left, and Rogo decides that he will be the one to be in charge of setting off the device. But Bishop Schmidt decides otherwise. He wants to set it off himself, but Rogo won't let him. He says that he should do it because it's his job. But Bishop Schmidt reasons with him that Rogo has someone waiting for him at home, but Bishop Schmidt has no one, so he should set off the bomb. Bishop Schmidt says a quick prayer to God, asking for him to intervene one last time, maybe to save his life. He is finally able to set off the bomb, which successfully blows a hole in the side of the ship, allowing them to escape. They use a megaphone to tell people that the Poseidon is going down, and people begin running toward the hole to get out, cause now that they've blown up another hole, air can escape easily. And so, finally, the first people are able to jump out and be saved from the Poseidon. Eventually, everyone in the group is able to escape. Shelby, Rachel, the Australian guys, and many others. The SEALs then get warm blankets for them, and are able to wrap them up. Oh, and Dylan has also wrapped his camera in some sort of trash bag that is able to keep it dry, so all of the film and footage will be able to be survived. Now, I may not be religious, but Bishop Schmidt survived, so we're just gonna say for the sake of the movie that God was able to intervene and he was able to be alive. But he does seem to be a little bit injured. Dr. Ballard also jumps in, but it's hard for him to swim due to his broken arm. Bishop Schmidt and Rogo finally jump, meaning that the last people are now saved from the Poseidon. Back at the Navy HQ, they announce that 9 people were saved, but not everyone is happy. The British intelligence agent is not happy because so many have died and only 9 survived, but the others are celebrating that some people survived and that they were able to complete their mission successfully. Dylan points at the ship and takes out his camera. The Poseidon is now really sinking. Air begins to escape from the ship, and it begins to go down by the front. The stern lifts up into the water, and, in awe, everyone looks at the Poseidon as it sinks, knowing that they have made it. This experience has changed the people's lives forever, especially Richard and the dysfunctional family, as they're now closer together than ever when put in a life or death situation. The Poseidon's stern lifts out of the water, and slowly, but surely, she finally slips under the waves, ending the movie, and bringing this very, very long video to a close. But I'm still gonna give my thoughts on the movie and some other background knowledge later, so we still have a little while to go. Don't worry. So, it's been a few days since I recorded the last bit of the video because I was busy celebrating Christmas, but now that I'm back, I've actually done my research on this, and I've also researched some other bad ship movies, and I can definitely say this one is not as bad as people make it out to be. Yes, the marketing is bad, and it does the occasional thing of, in cruise ship movies, constantly there being a different ship every 2 minutes. But overall, in the movie, it actually has some pretty redeeming qualities to it. For one, the CG is actually not that bad, except for, well, a different scene, it actually looks pretty good in most of the shots. Kind of. But in other movies, when they use cruise ships, they just use stock footage or the Queen Mary, because every cruise ship movie has to have the Queen Mary. Even the Love Boat featured the Queen Mary for a few shots. But overall, there was a lot of attention to detail made in this movie. There's almost no repeating sets except for when it's necessary, and the sets themselves look pretty good. And, as usual with every Poseidon movie, the rolling over scenes also look really nice. But overall, I would like another, more professional film buff's opinion on this, someone that knows a bit more about film than me, hint hint wink wink. But I think overall it was actually relatively well made. For the budget that it was given, which I could not find, they actually did a pretty good job with it. There are some continuity errors, like for example them leaving South Africa, but the port they were filming in obviously being in Greece, and some other things, but overall, the movie is very well produced, and the dialogue, while not the best, isn't that bad either. I also like that they added a few new interesting characters. A bishop, a film producer and his wife, and the dysfunctional family. Well, it could have been better handled, to be fair, but I think they did a relatively good job with it. There are only a few characters that I say were not that well made, like, for example, the cruise director, who I think was kind of just a dry character that was only there for just convenience, and also Mr. Kamal, which died pretty quickly. And also the hotel manager, which I get that in the other movies they actually have some reasons to stay, but in this movie, he just seems like a control freak and would not be an actual good hotel manager. I mean, one of the requirements for working in that industry, I'm pretty sure, is that you're supposed to be good with people because you're going to be interacting with people a lot, so for that, he's pretty bad at it. But I think overall, people are being a bit too harsh on this movie. With what they had, they did a very good job, and I think it's a pretty enjoyable movie. But I will mention the elephant in the room, Poseidon, the movie that was being produced at the exact same time and came out a year after this one. This movie is undoubtedly the better movie, I will say that up front. But there are definitely some things that this movie does better. For example, I think the characters are actually a lot better in this movie than in Poseidon, because in Poseidon, you're kind of just introduced to them and then they begin getting killed off. You don't really feel for these characters when they're killed in the newer movie. So, it's kind of nice in this movie that they spend an entire hour developing the characters and telling us why you should care for them. But of course Poseidon also does feature some pretty good CG. I mentioned some bad CG in the other movie, but I think for this one it hasn't aged a day. If you guys do want me to do a video on the 2006 Poseidon, maybe I will, to finally close off the series of all the Poseidon movies. Wait, what's this one? No, I am not doing a video on Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. You know what? I'll do a video on Beyond the Poseidon Adventure if this video gets 1,000 likes. I get that that's a big aim, but it's because I don't want to make that video. Anyways, returning to the 2005 Poseidon Adventure, let's talk about the ship a bit. I think that it's actually pretty impressive, the ship that they made for this movie. It's actually very realistic, and I could see it working in the modern cruise industry of today. But the same goes for the 2006 Poseidon. The 2006 Poseidon is famous in the ship community for tons of people wanting it to actually exist. And for this 2005 one, I also want it to exist. It does seem like a very nice ship, and I think that the producers did their research in terms of cruising. It is not as beautiful as the 2006 Poseidon, but it's definitely more economical and would work very well in the modern cruise industry. I also really like the livery on this ship. I just like the color blue on ships, so it gets my pity vote. Honestly, I think people are fixating on the bad things of this movie too much just because it makes a good video, and they're not acknowledging the good things, because there is a lot of good things with this movie, but there's also a lot of bad things. It definitely was less well made than the 2006 one, but there was a lot of heart that went into this movie, and it took quite a bit to make. Also, in this movie, the captain character is named Paul Gallico, as a reference to the person who wrote the original Poseidon Adventure book. So, that's pretty cool, especially because the other movies, even the 2006 one, don't pay any homage to the other movies past. And also, Dr. Ballard is named after Dr. Robert Ballard, who discovered the Titanic, so I really like that little attention to detail, and you can tell that the director knew this, and wanted to make this movie with as much cool references as possible, which is why there's a lot of references to the original movies and other shipping history. Let's read a review from someone who gave it 3 stars on IMDb. This thing had first draft written all over it. A prologue that takes away any suspense, and a new way of capsizing that doesn't make any sense, completely unnecessary subplots, and an excruciatingly drawn-out climax. The original had a scene where one character goes off alone, valiantly sacrificing themselves in a one-way trip. In this remake, They're accompanied by someone else, making the sacrifice totally unnecessary, and robbing the scene of any power. It's so bad that some characters at the end of the movie, in another unnecessary subplot, sit around looking at their watches in the middle of the climax. Rutger is the only one that has a half-decent performance and struggles valiantly with the lines he's given. Utterly woeful, very worthy of names Gutenberg and Baldwin. So first here he talks about the scene where they raid a terrorist cell in the first part of the movie, the prologue, as he calls it. He's basically saying that it takes away any suspense from the movie. I don't think this is true, and I do think that he does have a point in that making the movie so that it was over time revealed that it was a terrorist plot instead of it just being presented to us at the beginning would be a nice idea. But I don't know how they could have gone about doing that. They would have eventually needed to explain more about the terrorist cell, but they could do a scene where basically the people at the US Navy base figure out what's going on, and so the one girl tells the admiral everything about the terrorist cell, and also, by that, explains it to the audience, which would actually be a very nice idea. Next, he mentions the capsize, which, yes, this is one of the things that's talked about every single time this movie is brought up in the ship community, that the capsizing just doesn't make sense. A bomb on one side of the ship would not have been enough to capsize it. I kind of agree with this, but at the same time, they did kind of explain this in the movie, where basically they trimmed the stabilizers or got rid of them, or disabled them to get better speed, and also they were going through a storm, but the sea did not look very wavy, and also removing the stabilizers would not have made much sense. I was on a cruise ship where the stabilizers could barely do their magic because of how slow the ship was going, but it didn't even rock that badly. I guess over time I've kind of come up with other ways to explain it, like, for example, when the bomb went off, it slowly flooded one side of the ship but not the other, meaning that it listed heavily, and with the ship already being top-heavy, this meant that it could not survive. But they should have explained that in the movie if that's how it really went. Even the characters poke fun at it in the movie, asking questions like, wait, then why did we capsize? And things like that. Also, interesting little tidbit, in this scene over here, you can actually see Shelby clinging to the table, and she will be trapped up there for a little bit. So it's not like she just spawns up there and they forget to add her or explain how she got there. So yeah, attention to detail, my friends. He also talks about unnecessary subplots. I assume this is mainly referring to Richard having an affair, but that subplot is not really expanded on or drawn out, and I actually think that it led to some pretty interesting scenes. But I could do without it, because that woman eventually does die in the movie later, so she was a bit of an unnecessary character. I can kind of see what he means by the unnecessary subplots, but personally I liked them. I like when movies are longer because, I don't know, I just enjoy them more. Then he mentions the fact that the climax was a lot longer than expected, and I kind of understand that. I did want it to go by a bit faster. I think that the movie would have actually been a lot better if there was no blockage and they could have just jumped out the ship immediately. Like I said, I like long movies, but when they add things just to make the movie longer, I don't like it. He also mentions this scene here and basically says that everyone is being babied along by Rogo and Bishop Schmidt, which is kind of true, and that there is no valiant sacrifice at the end, because the people that do die near the end are just unnecessary characters, and Bishop Schmidt somehow survives being right next to the explosion. But the sitting around looking at their watches part, I don't really get. They don't do that in the movie. Unless they mean looking at the ship as it sinks, but they do that in every movie. Overall, I think this movie is pretty good. I think people are being a bit too critical when it comes to the whole, oh, bad thing, and that they should also be looking for the good things in the movie, which they don't do a lot. This movie is a pretty enjoyable watch, but admittedly, to someone who's less interested in ships, this might not be the movie for them. If you want to watch the Poseidon series, start with the first one, then go to the 2006 one, then go to this one, maybe. It's a pretty good movie, and I think that you will enjoy it, but If there's ever a friend of mine that wants to watch the Poseidon series, I always start them off with the 2006 one, because I just think it's the best for a modern generation, but this one's the best for cruise ship enthusiasts like me, definitely. If there's anything to take away from this video, I think that you should give this movie a try. Don't just read the reviews and think about it based on those. A lot of people will actually like movies that have bad reviews, in one way or another. I think that this is a relatively nice movie, and most people watching this will enjoy it. Although I've kind of spoiled it already with this video, hopefully you can agree that this isn't as bad as people say it is. But let me know down in the comments what you think. I'm probably missing a few things, but this is all I can say for now. So, will this movie eventually get the respect it deserves? Why did it capsize with just a terrorist bomb? And when will the next Poseidon movie be coming out? That's a very good question. And remember, never watch Beyond the Poseidon Adventure.